Good morning, people of grace. So good to have you joining us online today. My name is Tim Wallace. I'm the pastor of Grace Bible Church here in Rainbow City, Alabama. And we're thrilled to have you with us, and we pray that this morning will minister to you in your home or wherever you are listening to us. We are studying in the book of Acts, as we've been studying for a long time at our church here. We're calling it this series, The Church in Action. And today we're going to be in Acts 22. A friend of ours, Andrew Warren, is going to read the passage for us, and he's actually going to start in the verses right at the conclusion of Acts 21 that lead into Acts 22. So I invite you, if you have a Bible with you, to follow along, or maybe the Bible on your phone. Turn to Acts 21, verses 37 through the end of the chapter there, and then into chapter 22, Andrew will read down to verse 16. That's Acts 21, 37 through Acts 22, 16. Andrew, would you read for us, please?
As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then, who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" Paul replied, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said to me, 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting.' Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, 'What shall I do, Lord?' And the Lord said to me, 'Rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do.' And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me, and came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing by me said to me, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, 'The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on his name.'"
Thank you, Andrew. Well, if you've been with us, friends, in these last few weeks, we've been in the book of Acts, as I mentioned, talking about the church in action. And we have just come into the last part of the book. Chapters 21 to 28 is the ending of Luke's story in Acts. And Paul, the main character, is now in chains. As Andrew just read to us, Paul has just been arrested and put in chains in Jerusalem, and he will spend the rest of his ministry in the book of Acts as a prisoner, either sitting in a cell, sitting under house arrest, or traveling to go to see and stand before Caesar as a prisoner in Rome. Paul has just come to Jerusalem, as we mentioned last week, Even though some friends of his told him not to go, he felt like this was God's will for his life, and he is there to share the gospel in Jerusalem and wherever God sends him after that. Last week, if you remember, we left Paul in the middle of a riot. In chapter 21, that's when he's arrested. He's in Jerusalem celebrating Pentecost with his friends. He has 4 Gentile friends that he has brought with him from Ephesus and possibly some of the other churches that he started. They've traveled with him, and someone in the crowd sees these Gentiles and assumes that Paul has taken these Gentiles into an area of the temple that is off limits to the Gentiles. And that person shouts out in chapter 21, verse 28, "Men of Israel, help! This man brought Gentiles into the temple, and they have defiled this holy place." And suddenly it is on. When this man shouts this out, the crowd seizes Paul, it says, and they drag him out of the temple and start beating him, wanting to kill him, it says. The Roman soldiers rush in, grab Paul, and lock him up in chains. And in verses 35 and 36, we're told, as Andrew read, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him," which ironically are the exact words the crowd shouted to Pilate in John 19:15 about Jesus. Away with him. That leads us to this passage that Andrew read for us. Throughout the book of Acts, we've seen over and over again how unique of an individual Paul the Apostle is. We've seen his boldness, his brilliance, his determination, his never-dying passion for people, his passion for God's Word. He's just amazing. And we're going to see more of that today in this story. We're going to focus on 2 unique things about Paul today. His unique makeup or design, and his unique approaches or his unique ways of presenting Jesus. His unique makeup or design and his unique ways of presenting Jesus. We want to focus on that today. But as we've said many times in the book of Acts, the point of this is not for us to worship Paul or even be impressed by his uniqueness as much as it is, of course, to worship the uniqueness of Jesus, whom Paul is so passionate about. Paul would be appalled, pun intended, at us reading the book of Acts and thinking he is the point of the story. He is unique, as we'll see today, but it's because God has made him a unique instrument to point us to the one and only unique God-man, Jesus Christ. He is the only one worth worshiping. But as we talk about Paul and his boldness, his brilliance, and his passion to share Jesus with people, I want to ask you a question. Do you ever find yourself, as you're reading passages like we've read in Acts, or as you're hearing these sermons, do you ever find yourself wishing you were more bold like Paul? So do I. Do you ever wish that you could have the courage to share your faith in all kinds of situations like he does? So do I. Do you wish you could be unique like he is and unafraid of your insecurities and get past those and share your faith boldly? So do I. The point of this message today is to help you and me become more like Paul in embracing our uniqueness, the way God's made us, and the place that He's put us in to represent Him and share our faith. Here's the main idea I want you to get today from this story. We each have a unique design and a unique way to tell our story about how Jesus has changed us. Let me say that again. We each have a unique design and a unique way to tell our story about how Jesus has changed us. That's what I hope we'll see as we look at Paul's uniqueness in this story. So let's look at these two things that are very unique about Paul, and we're also going to see two things that are unique about us. Let's look first at something about Paul, and that is Paul's unique makeup, or his unique design, his unique attributes, or we might say his persona. Paul being Paul. What makes him Paul? I don't know if you noticed this when Andrew read today's scripture, but we started, as I said, near the end of chapter 21, and the bulk of the story, though, is in chapter 22. But the reason we started in chapter 21 is because these last verses point to something very unique about Paul. If you have your Bible open, look back at these verses where it says that Paul is about to be brought into the barracks, or the soldiers' barracks. Remember, he's being carried on the shoulders of these soldiers because of the riot. And as they are hoisting him on their shoulders, Paul apparently leans over and hollers out to the tribune, or the officer in charge, "May I say something to you?" And the officer responds with a question of his own, probably shouting over the crowd. He asked, "Do you know Greek?" He is stunned. This prisoner has yelled out to him in the Greek language. And then we see why he is stunned. He asked Paul another question. "Aren't you the Egyptian who recently led a revolt and led those 4,000 men out into the desert?" This tribune, or this officer, has rushed in with his men to break up the violence of the riot. But he has no idea who it is these Jews are about to kill. He thinks it's an Egyptian rebel rouser who recently led a revolt against Jerusalem. These types of uprisings happened all the time in Jerusalem, and in fact, they still do today in the Middle East. In fact, the Jewish historian by the name of Josephus actually tells us the story about this Egyptian rebel rouser who started this riot, and this officer mistakes Paul for him. But that's not who he has in his custody. This is Paul, the prisoner, who hollers back to him in Greek again, "I am a Jew, not an Egyptian. I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." So the officer here in the story, probably scratching his head, trying to figure this out, grants Paul permission to speak. Paul makes a motion with his hand, it says, and the people settle down to hear what he's going to say. And the chapter ends, chapter 21 ends with these words, "And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying." That's where 21 leaves off, and then chapter 22 starts, and Paul says in verse 1, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." Then he says, "And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet." Did you catch that? Luke is showing us a few very unique things about Paul's makeup, his design, who he is. Remember, he calls out to the officer in the language he understands, Greek. He asks him in Greek if he can speak to the crowd. And when he says yes, Paul speaks to the crowd in Hebrew, or most likely Aramaic, which was like the street language of Hebrew, the language the people spoke. Paul is uniquely gifted. Not many of us speak two different languages fluently. Most people who do moved from one place to another when they realized they needed to learn a new language to get along. Or some people are disciplined enough to take on the hardship of learning a new language. But Paul is not only uniquely gifted enough to speak two languages, but he was also uniquely born in a place where both languages were common. He tells the officer, I was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. In the King James Version, it says, a citizen of no mean city. And that doesn't mean mean as in angry or violent. It means no little or insignificant city. But Paul basically is telling this officer, I am from a well-known city and I'm educated. Tarsus is strategically placed on the map. As we've seen many times as we've looked at these maps, Tarsus is strategically placed at the southern end of modern-day Turkey, and it is a place that is a major thoroughfare for business, industry, and Greek culture. It is no insignificant city. It is a center of learning as well. It's what we might call today a university town. It's also a part of the Roman Empire, so to be a citizen there has great advantages, as we'll see in our story next week. Greek would be the language that Paul grew up speaking in Tarsus. All the people who come through there, the sailors, the businessmen, all the people coming through are going to be speaking Greek as part of the Roman Empire. But Paul is also a Jew. There was a large Jewish settlement in Tarsus, in Cilicia. So Paul would not only grow up learning Greek, but he would grow up learning Hebrew and Aramaic, as I said, the street version. And he could go back and forth as he does here, speaking Greek to the officer, speaking Hebrew or Aramaic to the crowd. He was uniquely gifted. He was also uniquely placed, being born in such a unique city. But that's not all. In chapter 2, verse 3, we read this. He tells us something else. Luke tells us something else about Paul's unique makeup or his identity. Paul says to these people in the crowd, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, Jerusalem, educated at the feet of Gamaliel. Now, it's one thing to be brought up speaking two languages like Paul was, but this is a whole other level here. Gamaliel is one of the most respected rabbis in all of Jewish history. All of Jewish tradition today remembers Gamaliel. He's in chapter 5, we see where he is a member of the Sanhedrin and he calms everyone down with a solution, trying to figure out who these disciples are. He's the wise, respected leader of all the Jewish nation. And Paul is one of his disciples who studied at his feet, it says. To be a disciple of Gamaliel would mean that you're in the top 10 or 15 students in all the world. Remember, Jesus had 12 disciples. Gamaliel would have about the same amount, and Paul is in that select group as a boy. It would be like saying today, I studied under C.S. Lewis at Oxford. People would stand up and listen to somebody like that. Paul is what we might call, apparently, a child prodigy. And even though he was born in Tarsus, apparently his parents moved to Jerusalem because he says, I was brought up here studying under Gamaliel. Wow, what a unique guy. We've known he's unique, but he is at the top of the crust. How could one guy have so many unique opportunities to succeed? Don't you wish you were like that? I do too. But that's still not all. Not only is Paul uniquely gifted and uniquely placed in a certain city he grew up in and a certain city he moved to, but he goes on to say, after he says, I was educated at the feet of Gamaliel, he says, I was trained according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers. This is what he refers to in Philippians 3 when he says, I was raised as a Pharisee. Then he says, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. What is he doing here? He is identifying with the crowd. He is saying, I want you to know who I am. I have been one of you. I am a Jew of the strictest sort. I appreciate your zeal for God. I can relate. I would be in the crowd with you a few years ago. We have the same makeup. We have the same interest, the same zeal for God. But then he's going to tell them, but something happened to me. I met Jesus of Nazareth on the Damascus Road, and it changed everything. Isn't it interesting how God uniquely designed Paul for what he is doing right here in this story and all through the book of Acts? We've been studying this for all these months, and we have seen him go on 3 long missionary journeys. If you look at the map again, we see where he goes across modern-day Turkey. He goes across the Mediterranean Sea back and forth into all of these cities, planting churches, preaching the gospel to Jews and to Gentiles. He goes first into synagogues. When he lands at a city and they have a synagogue, and he goes in there to preach. That was his custom. And what language did he use to do that? Why, Hebrew, of course. Then the Jews would almost every time throw him out of the synagogue, and what would he do then? He would go to speak to the Greeks, to the Gentiles. And what language would he use to do that? Why, Greek, of course. He was so gifted to be able to go back and forth, uniquely gifted and designed. He could have logical discourses with the geniuses in Athens at Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, where all the philosophers held out. But he also made tents for a living and hung out with the common workmen. This guy is so unique. He's so gifted. He was gifted for what God wanted him to do. Why did God make him that way? Well, he tells us back in chapter 9, the story of Paul meeting Jesus on the Damascus Road. Do you remember the story, the old man in the story by the name of Ananias, who God came to and said, Ananias, I've chosen you to go lay your hands on Saul of Tarsus. And Ananias, as if God doesn't know who he's dealing with, Ananias reminds God, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. Ananias is telling the Lord, I don't want to go talk to this man. But we see that the Lord has an answer to him. And he says in verse 15 of Acts 9, Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles, before the kings, and before the children of Israel. In other words, God is saying to Ananias, I have given this man a unique makeup because I have a unique calling for him. He is a chosen instrument of mine. I want him to be able to take the gospel to the Gentiles. So, I raised him up in a Gentile city, in a Greek world, in the Roman Empire, where he spoke Greek fluently. But I also, Ananias, have chosen him to carry my name before kings, which we will see in the upcoming chapters as Paul stands before kings and preaches the gospel. Paul is uniquely gifted to do that, as we will see in the upcoming weeks. But God also tells Ananias, I want this same chosen instrument to carry my name to the children of Israel. And to prepare him for that, how does a man from Tarsus in Cilicia end up doing that? Well, he's raised as a Jew, speaking Hebrew. But not only that, but I've designed him to be so smart. He studies with the Rabbi Gamaliel, and he is so zealous for the Jewish traditions that he becomes a Pharisee. He is so passionate as a Pharisee that he persecutes heretics in his mind, like these followers of the way, as they're called, following the one who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. This young man will grow up Jewish, and he will be passionate about that to the point where he pursues and persecutes these people who follow this dead so-called Messiah, he believes, named Jesus. Until he is stopped in his tracks in Acts 9 by this Messiah who is very much alive and is in bright glory, so bright that it blinds his eyes on the road to Damascus. And now Paul is here to tell these people his story. He is a chosen instrument of mine, Ananias. I have designed him uniquely. I have placed him uniquely to fulfill his unique calling. Wow. Isn't that something to see how God sovereignly designed and placed Paul where he did? Wouldn't it be something to have a unique makeup like that? Wouldn't it be something if God uniquely designed you and me like he designed Paul? Well, guess what? He did. We have a unique makeup. So let's talk about our unique makeup as well. I want to remind you of the main idea that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. We each have a unique design and a unique way to tell our story about how Jesus changed us. So let's talk about our uniqueness, your unique design. Way back in the book of Psalms is a psalm that Saul of Tarsus probably memorized as a Jewish boy, and you've probably memorized or at least heard this verse many times that talks about your uniqueness and my uniqueness. In Psalm 139, verse 15, it says, "But I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." The words there mean distinctly and creatively made, uniquely made, different from everybody else. I'm intentionally made by you. This passage, of course, talks about being made, being knitted together in his mother's womb. But not just Paul, but us. We are uniquely made. Wonderful are your works, David the psalmist says. My soul knows it very well. David in this psalm is talking about the unique way God knits us in our mother's womb, and so of course that refers to our body. But it's not just our body. We're not just a physical creature. We also have a personality, and God uniquely knits our personality. Parents who have sons and daughters in the same family come out of the same mother, but they come out with uniquely different personalities, sometimes night and day differences between them, not only in body, but in personality. Your gifts are different. Even your weaknesses are part of the uniqueness of who you and I are. Paul is not the only one who's been designed uniquely for the unique calling that God has for him. You and I are as well. Friday night, you may have read or heard that J.I. Packer, the great British theologian and writer and scholar, passed away at the age of 93 to go be with his Lord. J.I. Packer used to tell the story of how when he was a little boy, he was hit by a car. I heard him tell this story one time when I got to hear him. He told the story of how he was an athletic boy. He loved riding his bicycle, playing ball of different kinds in the yard, and running around like boys do. And one day he ran out in the street to get a ball, and he got hit by a car. If you notice the picture on the screen, you can see a dent in his forehead. That's where he was injured by the car. He was almost killed. But they were able to do surgery and told him he could not go outside and play like normal boys for a little over a year, I believe it was. And he talked about how frustrating it was to have to stay in the house and look out the window and see all the other kids playing. While he was in the house, he had nothing to do, and out of boredom, he picked up a book and began to read it. He didn't read anything before that he didn't like to read. But he enjoyed the story in the book and then read another book. Pretty soon he started enjoying reading. He told us this story and then he said, you know, if I hadn't been hit by that car, my life would have been totally different. He talked about how he believed God sovereignly allowed that to happen. Because if it didn't happen, he wouldn't have read, and he certainly wouldn't have written, and he wouldn't have become a professor and a theologian and preacher. Everything would have been different. But God not only uniquely designed his mind and his body, but his circumstances. That's the same thing he does for you and me. He designs us. He places us in certain places. He designs and is in control of our circumstances for us to do his unique calling. Let's talk about not only your unique design, but quickly talk about our unique placement. Did you know that God sovereignly chose where you'd be born? Did you know that God sovereignly decided and determined who your parents would be? Did you know He would design who your siblings would be? Did you know He would design where you might move to later? What you might do for a living? He designed even who your co-workers might be or your neighbors might be. Rico Tice is a pastor in England, also in London, at the All Souls Church, the church where John Stott was the pastor for so long. Rico Tice is the author of many books, but this is a little book of his called Honest Evangelism. Rico is the pastor of evangelism and outreach at All Souls Church in London. He talks about how God has uniquely placed us. And he refers to a passage in Acts 17 that we looked at several weeks ago. And he says, this is what God says about him and about people. In Acts 17, verse 26, it says, and God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. Did you know God determined and planned the period of time you'd live and the boundaries of your dwelling place? Here's what Rico Tice says in his little book. So there is a God who made the world and everything in it, including my neighbors, my relatives, and my work colleagues. He made everything and everyone, and He doesn't need them, but they need Him. He gives us all breath, every breath we take. Not only that, but He has marked how long every person will live and decides where they will live. Now hold on to your seat, he says, as we think about what this means. Your neighbor lives down your street because God put them there. Your colleagues at work sit at the next desk to you because God sat them there. Rico says, a family moved into our street in London, just opposite to our house. They are Muslims. Why have they moved in? They think it's for work and because it's close to a mosque. But no, in fact, God has put them there. Why? Let's look at the next verse, he says. And then he quotes from Acts 17:27, where it says, God did this, allotting where they would live and the period of time they'd live. God did this so they would seek Him and perhaps reach out for Him and find Him, though He is not far from any one of us. Did you ever stop to think about how God has uniquely designed not just Paul, but you, and how He has uniquely placed you and me in the house where we live, the city we live in, the state, the job we have, the place we go to school, and He's also placed our neighbors and co-workers beside us. Paul was uniquely designed. We are uniquely designed. But the third thing we want to look at quickly is Paul had unique ways of presenting Jesus to people. Paul, as we've seen so many times in the book of Acts, had innumerable ways of presenting Jesus. But he basically boils it down to three standard ways that he does this. But they're all unique. The first way that he presents Jesus is, as I mentioned earlier, when he goes into a city, his custom was to go to the synagogue and preach to the Jews. And he would do that by reasoning with them from the Scriptures. We see an example of this. It's one of many in Acts 17 when he comes to Thessalonica. And it says, they came to Thessalonica where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Paul went in, as was his custom, and reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead. Paul's way of reaching Jews was to go to the synagogue. He knew they'd be there every Sabbath, every Saturday, and he would reason with them from the Scriptures, showing them the prophecies, and then showing how the Messiah, Jesus, fulfilled them, and then presenting Jesus to them for salvation. That's how he presented Jesus to the Jews. But as I said, most of the cities he goes into, he gets thrown out. Usually he wins a few converts amongst the Jews, but the majority want him out of there because he's a heretic to them. So then he goes to the Gentiles. And again, a little bit later in Acts 17, we see that he left the synagogue and he went to the Gentiles in the city, and he walked amongst the marketplace and he conversed with them. And then he goes to Mars Hill where the philosophers hang out. And in Acts 17:18 we see some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, two of the main groups of philosophers, also conversed with him. What does that mean? It's a different way of presenting Jesus. Why? Because these philosophers are secular. They don't know Moses and Abraham and David. They can't understand the prophecies of the Old Testament. They're not Jews. So Paul has to take a unique approach, a unique way of presenting Jesus to them. In the synagogue, he speaks Hebrew and uses the Scriptures. Speaking with these secular people, he speaks Greek, their common language, and he converses with them. In Acts 17, he finds a point of identification with them, this idol that says, "To the unknown God," and he says, "Let me talk to you, let me converse with you about a God that is unknown to you, but he is the God who created the heavens and the earth." Paul is unique in his approach, his way to present Jesus. In the synagogue, reason from the Scriptures. In the city, converse with the Gentiles. There's one other way that we see in chapter 22 that he does. This is when he has apparently just a short, limited time. He tells his story. He says, "Let me tell you my story, what happened to me." And basically what Paul does in Acts 22, what Andrew read to us, is tell his testimony, as we'd say, or his story of what happened. His before, his encounter with Jesus, and then his now. I want to use this to challenge you and me to be unique in our ways of presenting Jesus. But I want to teach you a simple way to share your faith today based on what Paul does. On the screen, you see this slide of before Jesus and now, and it's blank. If you're a member of our church and on our email list, you should have received an email this morning with an attachment with a chart like this for you to tell your story before your encounter with Jesus and now. And I would like to present this to you. If you're not from our church and would like one of these, email me at gbc, for Grace Bible Church, gbc.tim@gmail.com. and I'll send you one. Or just take a piece of paper, put 3 columns there, before, Jesus, and now. I want to present to you a unique way for you to present Jesus that is so easy and accessible. Before, at the top of the little chart that I sent out, it says, there was a time in my life when I was, and then there are 2 blanks. There was a time in my life when I was like this and like this. But then I met Jesus. And Jesus helped me turn from my sin. He forgave me. I received Jesus' forgiveness, and I began to follow him as the King or Lord of my life. That's the encounter with Jesus. And then after that is, now my life has changed in this way, and 2 blanks there. 2 blanks, this is what I used to be like. I met Jesus. Now this is what my life is like, 2 blanks. This is basically what Paul does in chapter 22. And we'll see in a few weeks when he talks to Herod the king, he uses this same example. He doesn't have a lot of time, so he tells his story. This is what I was like. This is how I met Jesus. This is what I'm like now. I want you to take that piece of paper, and I want you to take a pen and write this down even as I'm talking while I tell you what mine looks like. In the left column, it says, there was a time in my life when I was, and on my sheet, it says this, I was angry, and I was without purpose. Now, many of you have heard my story. I was a church kid, and I heard the gospel all the time. But as a teenager, I was an angry person. I was happy-go-lucky with all my friends, but I would come in to the house and I would slam every door in the house and go to my bedroom. And if my little sister Donna happened to stick her head in that room, I would yell at her. Why? Because I was angry. One time my mom asked me, probably more than one time, she asked me probably several times, but I remember one time specifically she said, Timmy, why are you always so angry? And I could not answer that question. I had no idea who I was mad at. Down inside, I was lonely and empty, which was the other thing I put there. I was without purpose. I thought I'd grow up to be some great athlete or some superior person somehow, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then, as a senior in high school, I gave my life to the Lord. I met Jesus. He forgave my sin. I received his forgiveness, and I began to follow him really for the first time, even though I was a church kid. Now, my life has peace instead of anger. I can't explain that. I still have my moments, but I have peace that Jesus gave me. I also have meaning in my life. I have a purpose that he's given me, and part of that purpose is to share this story. I want you to take that little piece of paper and on the left side put down, there was a time in my life when I was blank and blank. Pick 2 words that represent what you were like before you met Jesus. And then on the right column, put 2 answers there of what you have now in Jesus. That little exercise can become your story. And the beautiful thing about this is you can tell this story in 15 seconds. A few years ago, a friend of mine from Texas, Bob Stanberry, came and shared this at a men's retreat with us. And Bob talked about this being a 15-second testimony. Paul is in the middle of this riot. He doesn't have long. He doesn't know how long these people will listen to him. So he says, this is what I was like. I met Jesus. This is what I'm like now. And you and I can use that model too with this chart. It's a 15-second testimony, or as Bob called it, an elevator speech. You could actually tell this to someone on an elevator before you get a couple floors up. It's that simple. Why do we need to do this? Well, it's the same reason Paul did. We are his chosen instrument too. Ananias, go. For this person, Tim or Joe or Susie, is a chosen instrument of mine that I have uniquely designed, and I have uniquely placed them in their setting, where they work, where they live, where they go to school, so that they reach Gentiles, Jews, maybe even kings with their story. Let me just close with this, friends. Since we've been going through the book of Acts, we have seen this over and over again, the boldness of Peter, then the boldness of all the apostles, the boldness of Paul, over and over again. As we are nearing the end of this book, I don't want us to just say, wasn't Acts a great book of a lot of information? I hope that you and I will say, the book of Acts changed my life and helped me become the person that God chose me to be, to step into the role that He has for me as His chosen instrument. I got bold and I stood up and spoke up, telling people what I was like, how I met Jesus, and what I am like now. I'm not perfect, but He's changed me. Let me say this. We are living in this desperate time. What is going on with COVID-19 is scaring people to death. What has happened with the racial issues and all the vitriol and hatred and violence is scaring people to death. People who don't know Jesus may not admit it, but they are worried about what is happening in this world. And you and I are walking around like people who had the cure for cancer, but we can't speak. I want to challenge you and me to say and practice this 15-second speech. This is what I was like. I was blank and I was blank. I met Jesus and now I'm blank and I'm blank. That simple. You never know whose life might change. Andrew, who read the scripture earlier, shared with me a story this week. There's a Bible teacher by the name of Paul Washer, who was a missionary in South America, and now he's a preacher, and he's just a gracious, warm man. I've never met him, but he just comes across so warm and friendly, and he's a great Bible teacher. Sometimes we meet somebody like that or hear them and assume they've always been that way. Andrew asked me this week if I knew Paul's testimony, his story. And I said, no, I'd never heard that. And he told me how Paul was a student at a university and was a bodybuilder and was taking steroids and other drugs and was sleeping around and living a wild partying life. And one night when he came in from a party, his misery, his emptiness hit him. And about 2 a.m, he was staring at the ceiling and there was a knock at his dorm room door. When he opened the door, there was a little guy there who was kind of nerdy, who lived down the hall. And he said, Paul, I need to talk to you. And Paul was built up and a great big muscular guy, and he said, what do you want? And he said, I feel like the Lord told me to come talk to you about Jesus. And Paul was getting ready to throw him out, but he couldn't because he had just been thinking about how miserable he was. And this trembling little guy shared with him the story of how Jesus died for his sins and could change his life. And then he left thinking that he didn't do any good. But Paul gave his life to Jesus. He was angry. He was on drugs. He was sleeping around and partying. He met Jesus, received forgiveness, and he became a peaceful person. A person that God is using tremendously to preach the gospel in South America as a missionary and now all over the world, in English and in Spanish. How did it happen? One guy shared his story, shared the story of Jesus. You and I are each uniquely designed, and we are uniquely placed to have a unique way to tell our story about how Jesus changed us. Let's do it.
Thank you for listening today to this message from our pastor, Tim Wallace, at Grace Bible Church. You can listen to this and other sermons by visiting our website at rbcgrace.com. That's rbcgrace.com. Our prayer is that you will experience God's incredible grace.